Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 456. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot of news to talk about on today's show, but first I want to remind everyone that we are holding a fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute, and right now we have matching funds. So if you make a donation, your donation will be doubled. $100 becomes $200, $50 becomes $100, and it's a great way to help out the Institute, still get yourself some great Institute swag, and your dollars end up doing double what they would have done otherwise. So if you can, head on over to the Institute, give us a donation, help us out, and that way I could continue to write articles, put out this show, and all the other great work that myself and my colleagues at the Libertarian Institute do. And with that, let's get into today's show. All right, almost everything I have to talk about on today's show has to do with the war in Russia. However, over this past weekend was the anniversary of the U.S. dropping atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so there was a statement from Hiroshima's mayor on Sunday, and he called for world leaders to recognize the, quote, folly of nuclear deterrence at a ceremony marking the 78th anniversary of the U.S. dropping an atomic bomb on the city, killing an estimated 140,000 people. He said, leaders around the world must confront the reality that nuclear threats now being voiced by certain policymakers reveal the folly of the theory of nuclear deterrence. They must immediately take concrete steps to lead us from this dangerous precedent and towards our ideal world. He urged Japan to join the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And so this is a treaty that currently has 92 signatories. I think at 50 in the world of the UN non-binding resolutions was supposed to take effect for every country. And it's like a more modernized non-proliferation treaty, but it really seeks to eliminate nuclear weapons, which I guess the NPT does call for as well. But this treaty is a little bit stronger in language, and unfortunately, it has gained absolutely no traction with any of the nuclear powers, and so it doesn't seem like it's going to be likely to actually, in effect, reduce nuclear weapons uses. But, the more countries that signed on to it, the more of an argument that you can make for it and other countries joining it. So this was good news. Now, we also had the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, who actually represents Hiroshima in Parliament, and he also spoke at the ceremony. He said 78 years ago today, a single atomic bomb deprived people said to number well more than 100,000 of their precious lives. It reduced the city to ashes and deprived people of their dreams and bright futures in an instant. Even those who escaped death suffered hardships that words cannot describe. And certainly when you read about the effects of the nuclear weapon and what happened and how the targets were selected and, who was actually in those cities and, about the 250,000 people killed in the bombings is absolutely horrific. So certainly, if you're not super familiar with, some of the arguments around the atomic bombings, particularly that American military officials didn't want to do it. It was really a political decision made by politicians and not a decision made by military thinkers. I know now that the narrative is always put forward to Americans. This is certainly what I learned in high school, that without the nuclear bombs, we would have had to invade the Japanese mainland, and then 1 million people would have died. So this was really the, quote, humane, is what they will say, decision to make, when in reality that clearly wasn't the case. And there's a lot of good work done on that. If anybody's interested, send me a message on Twitter, Facebook, wherever, and I could send you some articles if you're interested. Also, I think it's, worth discussing the other war crimes America committed during World War II. The bombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Japanese cities. And I'm sure there's quite a few others, that we could talk about. Certainly crimes that were committed in America, like the internment of the Japanese. But so, just want to make the point here that the nuclear bombing was unnecessary. And if you're looking for any more information on that, I could send some to you. I don't want to do a whole show on it today, but there's a lot of interesting quotes from high-ranking military officials at the time, essentially all the high-ranking military officials at the time, saying that this was completely unnecessary and problematic. All right, now let's move on to the war in Ukraine. And for a huge change, maybe to say this is good news is overstating it, but more Americans are coming around to having a much more reasonable opinion on the war in Ukraine. And while we know that in foreign policy, it often isn't enough just for Americans to be opposed to a policy, it certainly starts to help and will give the few advocates in Congress against more spending on Ukraine, some more ammunition to use to make arguments against it. So Dave DeCamp writes here, the majority of Americans oppose additional spending on the war in Ukraine, according to a CNN poll that was released on Friday. The poll was conducted by SRSR from July 1st to 31st, with a sample size of about 1,200. It found that 55% of respondents say Congress should not authorize more spending on the war in Ukraine, while 45% say more funding should be authorized. When asked if the U.S. has done enough to support Ukraine, 51% said yes, and 48% said more should be done. The results show support for the policy of backing Ukraine against Russia has waned as the conflict has drained on. A poll conducted when Russia first invaded in February 22 found respondents thought the U.S. wasn't doing enough. When asked about what type of support the U.S. should provide Ukraine, only 17% favored sending U.S. troops for direct support combat operations against Russia, which could quickly spiral into nuclear war. The most popular type of support was assisting with intelligence gathering, military training, and providing weapons. Most Republicans opposed additional aid for Ukraine, as Democrats continue to support it. The poll found that 71% of Republicans are against Congress authorizing more spending on the war, and 59% believe the U.S. has done enough. The majority of Democrats want the U.S. to provide more support for Ukraine, with only 62% favoring new training and 61% saying the U.S. hasn't done enough. So far, Congress has authorized $113 billion in spending on the war in Ukraine. The polls came as the White House is expected to ask Congress this month to approve another military spending package for Ukraine. And I did read that the U.S. was now basically down to their last $6 billion in weapons aid that they could send Ukraine. That magical accounting that they, figured out just a couple months ago. And they're like, oh, accounting error in your favor, $6 billion more dollars to send to Ukraine. Well, they're starting to use that fund. So this is, I think, a huge story. We're going to have a major fight on our hands in the coming weeks. And this is really, really important. So Biden expected to ask Congress for more Ukraine funding this week. The White House is expected to formally ask Congress to authorize additional funding for the war in Ukraine as soon as this week. The funding would be in the form of an, quote, emergency supplemental bill that would also include money for domestic disaster relief and potentially money for Taiwan. One source said the request would be north of, quote, $10 billion. The Biden administration is still working on setting the final number. So far, Congress has authorized $113 million to spend on the war in Ukraine. Financial Times previously reported that Biden wanted to include money for Taiwan in the Ukraine net spending bill. The Punchbowl News report said that Taiwan aid could be included as a sweetener for Republicans who might otherwise oppose supporting the Ukraine war. And this is just how ridiculous that our foreign policy has gotten. Now, I guess I remember when I was a kid, the kind of the narrative is, Democrats would or Republicans, one or the other, I guess, how depending on how you look at it. So if it was a Republican, they would look as they're going to increase domestic spending as a sweetener to get the Democrats to increase foreign policy spending, where, Democrats will look at it the opposite way. Now, the parties are both wanting to spend money on wars, and so they get each other to buy in by agreeing to spend money on each other's wars. All right, let's talk about what some of this money going to Ukraine is doing. U.S. approves first batch of M1A1 Abrams tanks for shipment to Ukraine. So I believe these tanks are currently in Germany, where the Ukrainian forces have been training on them. And the Army Acquisition Chief, Dub Bush, said the last of the set was officially accepted by the U.S. government or the production facility over the weekend, so they are done. The U.S. will be providing Ukraine with 31 refurbished M1 Abrams tanks, an older variant of the tank. The U.S. initially said it would send the newer M1A2 Abrams, but the Pentagon decided to speed up the plan by sending the older tanks. The M1A2s would needed to be manufactured and would have taken years to deliver. Bush said the tanks are ready. It will take time to deliver them and send necessary related equipment, which includes ammunition, spare parts, fuel equipment, and repair facilities. The Wall Street Journal reported in July that the U.S. is expected to arm the M1 Abrams tanks. It sends to Ukraine with depleted uranium rounds, a toxic ammunition that is linked to cancer, birth defects, environmental damage, especially in Iraq, where U.S. forces used an enormous number of the controversial munitions. When asked about the possibility of sending depleted uranium to Ukraine, Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Pat Ryder said on Monday that he had nothing to announce. The UK provided Ukraine with depleted uranium rounds for its British-made Challenger 2 tanks. President Vladimir Putin says that his decision to deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus was a response to Britain giving Ukraine depleted uranium. So we also have American cluster bombs heavily in use in Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal reported on Tuesday that U.S. forces that U.S. provided cluster bombs are fueling the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and detailed how Ukrainian forces are using civilian killing munitions against Russian soldiers. Cluster bombs are designed to spread small submunitions over a large area. They are so harmful to civilians because the submunitions or bomblets do not explode on impact and can be found years or decades after their use. Ukrainian soldiers said they're using cluster bombs to hit concentrations of Russian soldiers and vehicles. The report said the cluster munitions have helped Ukraine capture some Russian positions, but acknowledged the gains come at a high casualty cost. The cluster bombs are good. They are effective, said Captain of the Ukrainian Reconnaissance Company, but the Russians are dug deep and they learn quickly. The bombs won't be enough to tip the balance of the war in Ukraine, as the counteroffensive is struggling, and Western officials say it's highly unlikely that Ukraine will succeed. And this is something that I kind of thought would be the case, is that, and this is something that has been the case when, even the U.S. has used cluster munitions, and that is they may be somewhat effective rounds. Like, you could fire them downrange and they'll go, and most of the bomblets will end up exploding, or at least about 3/4 of them. To 25 to 15% probably won't explode, but the rest of them will, and that'll cause some damage to the enemy and present them some problems. However, it's also going to present a problem to the offensive army as well, because if you're looking to recapture territory, many of those cluster bombs that don't explode are in positions that seemingly you're seeking to capture if you're hitting the enemy there. So this could present a problem for Ukraine in the future if they do ever start making progress, which it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. All right, so this is an article that I wrote for antiwar.com at the end of last week. Ukraine strikes Russian commercial port with drone for first time. Ukrainian drones have struck a Russian commercial port for the first time since the start of the war. The Novorossiysk was shut down for a few hours after it was hit by Ukrainian air and sea drones. 2% of the world's oil supply and grains are shipped from the port. The Russian Defense Ministry claims it was able to down several drones targeting its ports on Friday morning. Moscow says its defenses were able to disable Kiev's drones targeting the Crimean Peninsula and the Novorossiysk, a port located on the Russian mainland. The Russian military dubbed the Ukrainian strikes as a terrorist attack. Kiev claims it carried out the attack. Ukrainian officials often deny responsibility for attacks conducted inside of Russia, in part because Kiev has made several assurances to Washington it would not use American weapons to target Russian territory. The Associated Press published satellite photos of Novorossiysk appearing to show a damaged Russian ship at the port. The security services of Ukraine said it is a Russian landing vessel. The outlets are reporting that the ship was heavily damaged and leaking oil. I did see some video that alleged to show this as well, so it does appear some kind of ship at least was hit, and the Spets do manage a ship within the Russian Navy, so it may or may not have been this particular vessel or a Russian landing vessel, but it does seem they were able to hit a ship that may not have been docked at port, but was near this particular port. A Ukrainian source speaking with Reuters said the ship was unable to engage in combat due to the damage, and a retired Ukrainian naval official told Reuters that the attack demonstrated a significant step up in abilities for Kiev as the drone flew an estimated 460 miles. The port that was attacked was reported to have resumed normal operations within hours of the attack. In recent months, Kiev has increased its attacks inside of Russia and on civilian infrastructure as Ukrainian forces have been unable to break Russia's defenses on the battlefield. Last month, Ukraine targeted the bridge that connects Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. Ukrainian militants with members who are openly neo-Nazis have used American weapons to carry out attacks inside of Russia. Some of the militants say they are working in coordination with Kiev. So this has led to Russia vowing a response. So Russia vows response after Ukraine drone hit Russian tanker. And so Russia says it will vow to respond to a Ukrainian attack that hit a Russian oil tanker in the Black Sea near Crimea on Friday night, which came after Ukraine's first strikes on a Russian commercial port. So this isn't necessarily just a response to the strike on the Russian commercial port, but the general trend of Ukraine using sea drones and other kinds of drones to attack Russian naval positions, or even commercial Russian positions located on the Black Sea. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said such barbaric actions cannot be justified and they will not remain without a response, while their authors and perpetrators will inevitably be held accountable. Facing no condemnation from Western countries and international organizations, the Kiev regime is busy applying more and more new terrorist techniques. This time is in the waters of the Black Sea. And then we also have Ukraine saying that it will just attack Russian shipping in the Black Sea. A Ukrainian official told Politico on Tuesday that all Russian ports and ships, including commercial vessels, are considered legitimate military targets as the war in Ukraine is escalating in the Black Sea. And this is from an economic advisor to Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. Everything the Russians are moving back and forth on in the Black Sea are valid military targets in our eyes. The comments come as Ukraine attacked a Russian commercial port and a Russian tanker, according to the Ukrainian security services. And a member of the SBU speaking to the media said the tanker was hit by a sea drone packed with almost 1,000 pounds of TNT, and the attack blasted a hole in the vessel's engine room. The Ukrainian officials said the attacks were in retaliation for Russia's bombardment of Ukraine's ports after Moscow said it would not renew the Black Sea grain deal. This story This is a quote from Zelensky's advisor. This story starts with Russia blocking the grain corridor and threatening to attack our vessels, destroying our ports. Our infrastructure is under constant attack. And so Russia withdrew from the grain deal because it said it wasn't satisfied with UN and Western efforts to make it easier for Russia to ship agricultural goods, which was another aspect of the agreement. We also had the Ukrainian attack on the Kerch Bridge the same day that Russia canceled it. So this is, I think, a pretty significant escalation. And this is something that I have been predicting and talking on the show, that if Ukraine wasn't able to make any progress in its counteroffensive, I thought we would see more attacks on, particularly inside of Russia, and, these coming over the land border with Russia. But I think this also means attacks on Russian ports in the Crimean Peninsula as well. All right, so let's talk about this counteroffensive. I have two stories here. The first is no breakthrough for Ukrainian forces in counteroffensive. This from DateToCampAntiWar.com a week ago. Ukrainian forces have still made no breakthroughs against Russian forces in the counteroffensive, despite sending thousands of more troops to the front in a renewed push for the southeast. Politico reported on Tuesday, citing unnamed Pentagon officials. U.S. officials said last week that the main thrust of the Ukrainian counteroffensive had begun, and that Ukraine committed NATO-trained forces it was holding in reserve. The push was focused on Zaporizhia, and the idea was to sever the, quote, land bridge that Russia has secured from Crimea to the Russian mainland, and there have been attacks on other areas along the front. Politico reported that Ukraine committed 150,000 troops to the assault along three axes of the attack, but the Pentagon official said the operations have not yielded significant results, with one saying Ukraine gains are being measured by the hundreds of meters. They are making mostly small incremental gains, one official said. They are facing stiff Russian resistance and the second and third layers of defenses. Now, the next is very concerning. So we have a Western official telling CNN in an article that was published yesterday that it is extremely unlikely that Ukraine will make any progress in its counteroffensive in the coming weeks that will alter the balance of the war in Ukraine. So this is from the unnamed senior Western diplomat. Quote, they are still going to see for the next couple of weeks that there is a chance of making some progress. But for them to really make progress that would change the balance of this conflict, I think it's extremely highly unlikely. Representative Mike Quigley, a Democrat from Illinois, also spoke with CNN about the counteroffensives and said the briefing Congress has received on the assault are, quote, sobering. He said the situation is the most difficult time of the war. Leading up to the counteroffensive, the discord leaks and media reports revealed the U.S. did not believe Ukraine could regain much territory. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that Western officials did not think Ukraine had enough weapons or equipment to dislodge the Russian forces, but the Biden administration pushed for it anyway, as it rejected the idea of a ceasefire. And so here we just have all of these Ukrainians just being thrown into the front lines, and this is demanded by the West. And there's the West doesn't even think there's a real chance for any progress here. And so just an absolute disgusting policy from Washington to treat Ukrainian lives this way. That, basically the life of a Ukrainian conscript is worth nothing more than what damage he could inflict on a Russian soldier, is how we're looking at this. All right, so Russia says Ukraine used Storm Shadow missiles to hit bridge connecting Kherson to Crimea. So this is going to connect, I guess, southern Ukraine that is in the hands of Russia with the Crimean Peninsula, which is firmly in the hands of Russia, that Russia has held since 2014. So the acting governor of Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine's southern Kherson Oblast said Sunday that Ukrainian forces used British-provided Storm Shadow missiles to strike a bridge that connects Kherson to Crimea. He said the Ukrainian attack struck the bridge and the village of Kongar in southern Kherson. He said Kiev's terrorists shelled the Kongar bridge and the settlement Kongar with NATO Storm Shadows. He said that the Storm Shadow's missiles caused damage to a school. So, we can't know for sure, but this seems to be something that's happening quite a bit, that Ukraine is using these longer range weapons provided by the West to hit civilians' targets. And, this is really something we have to worry about, and something that could lead to a major escalation in conflict between Russia and the West. Ukraine says talks with U.S. on security guarantees have begun. This is huge. And this is a really big story. And depending on how this plays out, it's going to have a major, major impact on if and how this war ends. So I think somewhat, I don't know. Maybe I'm overstating how the White House actually understands the problem with Ukraine joining NATO. But I do think that there's enough members of the White House that do understand that Ukraine joining NATO as a member presents a lot of problems, including escalation with Russia. And so they don't want to go that route. Now, it seems that the White House believes they found an end run around that, and that is them and all their allies in the G7, so that's mostly NATO countries plus Japan and maybe Australia, are planning to get together, and they are going to each engage in a security guarantee with Ukraine. So, if this security guarantee looks anything like a mutual defense promise, then I think it means that the war in Ukraine essentially cannot end, because Russia is going to see that as a promise that Ukraine is going to join NATO, and that Putin has made it clear that he will not allow that, and that's why he went to war in Ukraine in the first place. So if that is how this looks, then that's problematic. Now, the other way the security guarantee could look, I think, is essentially funding a perpetual war in Ukraine. It's going to, I think, lock Ukraine into like a situation where they really can't sign a deal with Russia, and then we're going to give them billions of dollars every year in arms, and basically just continue to send Ukrainians until we run out of them to the front lines to fight the Russian forces. And so my guess is the security guarantee looks a lot more like what the U.S. provides Israel than some kind of formal NATO membership for Ukraine. But again, whatever the U.S. says here is going to have major impacts on how this entire war plays out. All right. So there has been, a lot of military activity, not just in Ukraine, pitting Russian and American military forces in close encounters. And we documented this happening all the time over the skies of Syria. But we also had the UK complaining that it's intercepting dozens of Russian planes near the border between Russia and Estonia. And we also had the US saying that it's deploying 4 Navy destroyers in response to Russian and Chinese vessels operating near the Alaskan Aleutian Islands, which stretch far into the northern Pacific Ocean. And so if anybody looks at a map of Alaska, you have like the big chunk of Alaskan territory, which is, the lobe off of Canada, but you have this long stretch of, like, not a semicircle, it's probably like a quarter semicircle worth of islands that stretch far into the Pacific Ocean. And so those are apparently the islands that the Chinese and the Russian ships are operating around. And from China's perspective, my guess is they probably see these Aleutian Islands in a somewhat similar way that the U.S. sees the reefs in the South China Sea, as just basically things that America claims are important in theirs to extend the amount of like water and territory that they could claim belongs exclusively to America. And so I'm not surprised at all that we're seeing this from China and Russia. And I also think it's worth noting here that these are joint naval exercises, and This is a result of America's extremely hostile policy against both Russia and China. And, we could go back to kind of the start of the show when we were talking about, approving a weapons package with military aid for both Taiwan and Ukraine. Well, maybe that will rally politically in the United States more congressmen to be on board with giving aid to both countries over what they would be willing to do with just one. But it's also going to have the impact of politically pushing Russia and China closer together, and that presents its own problems for the United States. All right, here we go. So Saudi Arabia hosted some talks. I believe they happened over the weekend in Jeddah. We covered before the talks who was getting invited. I had mentioned that the purpose of this summit did not seem to be really a real peace talks, right? It wasn't that these countries were going to come together. They were going to help Russia and Ukraine sit down and come to some kind of negotiated solution. These talks were intended to give Ukraine a chance to convince potentially independent countries to say that the war has to end in conditions favorable to Ukraine. So I was surprised China and India attended these talks. Mexico said they would not attend the talks unless Russia was invited, which they were not. So I guess we didn't have a representation from Mexico there. And I don't think, anything really came of this as expected. However, it's just interesting that these talks took place and the Chinese showed up, which may indicate that, they really are looking to play a role in ending this war. Maybe they're trying to show that they're, willing to listen to the Ukrainians and the Russians as well and be mediators. All right, so Russia's economy projected to grow despite Western sanctions. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has said it expects the Russian economy to grow 1.5% this year, despite the U.S. and Western-led sanctions campaign against the economy, which Biden once vowed would turn the Russian economy into rubble. And, we've documented this throughout the war that the sanctions have largely seemed to backfire and harm Western economies just as much, if not more, than the Russian economy. And this is just further proof of that. All right, last up here before we wrap up the show for today, Poland claims Wagner fighters in Belarus are trying to destabilize NATO. At first, this seemed like a completely kind of crackpot pro-Russian theory. That we have people within the Western orbit who I think are concerned about portraying any development in the war in Ukraine or anything that happens in Russia through the lens of basically, what the Kremlin would want. And so, when the Wagner coup happens and Prigozhin declares his insurrection and starts taking, Russian military bases and things like that, and then ends up agreeing to go to Belarus. One thing that, the pro-Russia crowd points out as well, hey, these fighters are now able to enter Ukraine or enter another country. And it seems now that the pro-NATO people have picked up on that kind of idea, and they're suggesting that there could be a major war breakout or some kind of conflict breakout because the Wagner forces are in Belarus, and then they could, leave Belarus and go into Poland or something like that. I really don't think this is going to happen. It seems kind of ridiculous that Belarus would just attack Poland at this point. War is unpredictable. We're talking about Lukashenko and other people who are, corrupt government officials who we shouldn't count on to do things right or to not make stupid or foolish decisions. But just judging, this seems to be a particularly stupid or foolish decision. So I'm kind of guessing that they're not very serious about actually this happening, and this is mostly just Western propaganda, Polish propaganda meant to have NATO build up more forces along its eastern flank along the Russian border. And so I would look for more of that in the future, but just interesting how some of these narratives develop. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show. More shows later in the week.